My name is Paul Sewell and I'm a founding member of the New Reality magazine, which is an internationalist platform of progressive ideas, a bilingual digital magazine in Spanish and English that is willing to construct a new narrative of revolutionary and creative productive forces. We kindly invite you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our social media. Today, we are honoured to organise this magnificent event with our amazing speakers. We want to thank them all for their support, and you can write your questions in the comment area on our Facebook page if you have any questions for our speakers, and we'll get round to them a little bit later on. So now I'm going to introduce and give a warm welcome to our speakers, all of them professors of economy. First of all, we have Michael Roberts. He's a Marxist economist who's worked in the City of London for over 40 years. He has closely observed the machinations of the global capitalism from within the Dragon's Den. Since retiring, he's written several books: The Great Recession, A Marxist View, The Long Depression, Marx 200, A Review of Marxist Economics, and many other books. So I'd like to thank you, Michael, very much for joining us today. Other speakers that we have with us are Stavros Mavroudeas. He's currently Professor of Political Economy at the Department of Social Policy of Pantheon University. He was previously Professor of Political Economy at the Department of Economics of the University of Macedonia. He studied at the Economics Department of the National University of Athens, from where he received his BA in 1985. And he's also written many books on the subjects of economics. So we welcome him also. And we've also got Aberlardo Flores as a full-time professor in the Department of Economics at UNAM in Mexico City. He is a member also of the National System of Researchers as a PhD in economics. And we welcome him also. He's written many other books on that topic as well. So we welcome all you guys today. So first of all, I'll pass over to Michael, let you begin. So over to you, Mr. Roberts.
Well, I didn't know I was going to get the privilege of starting first, so I may lead to the position where Aberlardo and Stavros can take me apart later on with the mistakes I'm going to make. But let me just briefly, I just want to present just one little slide to you guys, which I will share, which outlines basically what I want to cover. And obviously, we can't really cover every single item to do with the Marxist theory of value in that time, but I'll try. So let me just start here, the basics of Marxist value theory. And what's interesting is that if you read Capital Volume 1, Marx does not start with immediately with an explanation of the nature of value or of surplus value and the terms of exploitation which are involved in his theory. He starts with an explanation of what a commodity is. And he says that the commodity is the most important thing we should consider first, because what is a commodity? It is all the things that we produce, that we need, that we use, things, not just physical things, but services for which we need to live and which need to reproduce in order to make our lives as human beings better or sufficient to survive. That's products, but the specific feature under the capitalist mode of production is that products are turned into commodities for sale on the market. So a commodity is a product that's being sold on the market, of course, for profit by those who owns and controls those commodities. But because of that, commodities have two features to them. They have a dual feature. It's not just the use that they have. That's obviously necessary. Otherwise, they can't be sold. Somebody has to have feels that they have a use for purchasing a product, but they also have an exchange value. They have a price in money terms that the owner of the product can obtain by selling on the market. So a commodity has two features, a use value and an exchange value, Marx says. And that dual feature of the commodity is the key to the contradiction in the capitalist mode of production, because it means that if the exchange value, that is the price, the money price that the owner of the commodity gets, is in contradiction, comes into contradiction with the use value, the product, its own particular use, then that contradiction means that perhaps those use values will not be produced, and they will also not end up in the hands of people who need them. So there's a conflict here between producing things that people need for social need in general and producing things for sale on the market. and that conflict exists within every commodity. It's the basic contradiction of the capitalist mode of production is found in just the commodity, and of course millions of commodities are produced and sold every day. But what makes one commodity similar and measurable against another commodity? It could be, is it their weight? Obviously, corn weighs differently from lead. Is it their size, their quantity, the space that they take up? So a gallon of oil, is it related to a small thimbleful of water? Is that the way in which we measure things to see if they're equal in value? No, Marx says if you really look at it, what is the real thing that brings about an explanation of the nature of things and the equality of values between different things as they're exchanged is the amount of labor time that goes into their production. So the key feature of both this commodity, which is divided between use value and exchange value, is the amount of labor time that goes into the production of these commodities. And that is the key. We can see it across the board that it's the only real way in which you can understand the development of commodities and the way in which they're exchanged on the market. And then so that means, for example, there is a difference also, not only between the use value and exchange value of a commodity, there is also a difference between the nature of the labor that is produced, that is operated, expended in order to produce these commodities. There is different sorts of labor, whether it's production, going out and building a piece of furniture, whether it's baking a piece of bread. All these are different sorts of labor, which Marx called concrete labor. But we can measure them across the board and use them to understand how they fit into the exchange value of a commodity by considering the social, on the basis of abstracting out of each individual concrete labor, the amount of labor time it takes to produce these different commodities. That's how we can measure across the board these different contributions of concrete labor. So we can abstract from the concrete labor a certain level of measurement of labor time, and that gives us the basis for measuring different commodities in relation to the amount of labor time involved. And more than that, it has to be labor time is on the average socially necessary. The average level of productivity using the existing technology, which allows us to give you an average labor time that is involved. So how much is produced in 1 hour of labor time can be averaged out, and that can be used as a measure of basically the value of commodities across the board. So that it would explain, for example, why a motor car might cost $20,000 and a piece of furniture in your house might only be worth $200, because on average, the amount of labor hours involved that are socially necessary will be different between the two items. One worth $20,000 worth of labor time, another worth $200 of labor time. On average, given the average technology and production that's involved. Now, one of the big arguments against the labor theory of value, or Marxist theory of value, based on this socially necessary labor time abstracted out of concrete labor, one of the big arguments is that surely that's not how things are valued or priced in the market. Surely they depend on how scarce they are. So, for example, if there's an abundance of water, then that water costs virtually nothing. But if we're in a drought area where there's very little water and people controlling that water can therefore sell it, they can get a price for it and the price of that water will rise. Or put it the other way around, that first glass of water might cost a lot of money in order to buy, but as you get more and more water, then the next glasses will cost less because you don't need them so much. So the utility of what you want to purchase, the usefulness to you, is actually what drives the price in something. And the scarcer it is or the more abundant it is, drives the price. So it depends on supply and demand of individual commodities, not on the amount of labor time involved. The most extreme example, I suppose, we can think of cases where there seems to be very little labor time in the product, and yet it is worth hundreds of millions of dollars or millions of dollars. Take a painting by Van Gogh of a vase of flowers. If you put that up in auction, and has been, of course, you can get 70, 80, $100 million for one painting of a vase of flowers by Van Gogh. And that probably took him a day to do. Is his labor time, socially necessary labor time, really worth $100 million? Clearly not. So that implies that there's something wrong with the labor theory of value. The answer to the question, of course, is that there are not hundreds and thousands of Van Gogh paintings available in the process of production for selling on the market as commodities. What there are on the market for selling as commodities are prints of Van Gogh's painting, which, if you can produce a huge number of these and sell them when you come out of the museum or whatever, buy a print. And what are those prints worth? They're worth about $30, $20, $30 to buy in a museum or online or whatever it is of Van Gogh's painting. So once you get into mass production of items, which are reproductions and not the original, then the amount of time to produce those reproductions, of course, then becomes much less. It's the social and necessary labor time involved in the production of that product. Van Gogh's vase of flowers as print is, of course, just a small amount compared to the one unique vase of flowers as printed by Van Gogh. So the argument that capitalism works on the basis of scarcity works on the basis of the idea that Van Gogh's painting is so unique and scarce that that's what drives the price is really irrelevant and just an exception that proves the rule about the nature of the process of production for commodities under capitalism. The other argument against the labor theory of value is that labor is not the only source of value. What about machines? Don't they produce more things? Can't you imagine a situation where robots produce robots, where they produce robots, and they produce all the things, services that we need, and there's no human labor time involved whatsoever? If we could imagine that hypothetical situation, then it would appear that machines create all the value and labor creates nothing. And that is correct. What they're creating is use value. They're creating the products that we need, these machines. But they don't add new value unless human labor turns the machine on, gets things going, and produces more value. So the machines contribute to the total value of the product based on how much value of labor time has been involved in producing the machines and the raw materials and components that are used to produce the new commodities. But the value is not created and produced unless human labor operates those machines and turns those raw materials and components into a new commodity that can be sold on the market. Only in the very extreme example of where it's a complete robot world can you talk about the end of commodity values or values in a commodity. Commodities have disappeared in that situation and you just have products and nothing else. So this brings me to the most important discovery that Marx made in his value theory. That's what he says. He said the most important discovery I made was not that value is based on the socially necessary labor time involved in producing it, that you have a labor theory of value is the only way of understanding how production in a commodity economy works. He says the most important thing I discovered, because other people have discovered that, if you like, is that how surplus labor in a capitalist economy is turned into surplus value. Throughout, there have been previous societies where once you get beyond the very level of primitive communism, where people just produce enough to get themselves to reproduce and survive the next day, the next year, and so on. Once you move beyond that level of human productive development into an agricultural commodity world where there's more agriculture, more resources produced for food than you need in one day. In other words, a surplus is begun to be created in an economy, in a society. That surplus can then be appropriated by a small group of people who control the surplus so that the rest of the population has no control over the surplus and everything is decided by those who control that surplus. So in a slave society, the owners of the slaves can use labor to produce all the things that they need, and they actually own human beings in to do that. So the surplus labor, which the slave owners get, is through the ownership of slaves. In a feudal serf society, the surplus labor is created for the lords to appropriate and use by keeping the serfs on the land who produce and work for the lord on his land for so many days in the year and the week, and for other activities as well, and even fight for them in battles. So the surplus labor created by the serfs is appropriated by the lord on the land. He controls the serfs. He doesn't own the serfs, but he controls their time and where they can live. So in that way, surplus labor is owned and controlled by the owners of that surplus labor, whether it be slave owners in a slave society or lords in a feudal society. But in the capitalist mode of production, that surplus labor is hidden. It's not obvious. It's obvious in a slave society that the slaves are owned and they produce for the slave owners where the surplus labor is. It's obvious in a feudal society that serfs work so many days for the lord, and that gives you a measurement of how much surplus labor is going to be appropriated by the lord. But under a capitalist mode of production, it's not clear where the surplus is being created or controlled, because workers go to work, they receive a fair day's wage, they get a wage contract, they're paid, and they work for that wage for so many hours. But it's a money trick, as you might say. It's a trick. They work for 8 hours, but they don't actually get the value of that 8 hours back into their wages. Perhaps they only get half the value of the product in labor time that they've produced, the commodity that they've produced, back in wages. So workers work 8 hours, they get paid really 4 hours of labor time. That's the agreement in their contract. The extra 4 hours is incorporated into the value of the commodity that the capitalist owns and sells on the market. So, and that's possible because the capitalists completely control the means of production, the machinery, the factories, the raw materials, and they control the product that's a commodity that's produced at the end of the process and sell it on the market for money. Hopefully they would think for more money. All that labor has, or the human beings have, or workers have there, the majority of the population, 99% of them, is their ability to sell their labor. But they sell their labor at a value in labor of their labor power that is less than the total value produced in the commodity. So surplus labor is created in a hidden way through what appears to be a fair exchange for wage labor, through an increase in total surplus labor through the sale of the commodity. The difference is the surplus value. That's a crucial argument of Marx's value theory. And that surplus value can vary depending on whether workers' hours are extended. So Marx talks about absolute surplus value. So if the working day is 8 hours, but it could be extended to 10 hours, then you get an increasing amount of surplus value if the wages don't change at all. So only 4 hours of labor time goes to the workers in wages. They give 4 hours in surplus value to the capitalists, but if you extend the working day, that could be 6 hours of working capital. Relative surplus value is another way. By increasing the productivity of the labor force, you can get more commodities in the same period of time, and those more commodities in the same period of time means that they are less, they're worth less in value, and that in particular, the amount of commodities that are required to keep the workers going can be reduced, so the value of labor power falls relative to the value of the commodities that are being produced. And although there hasn't been a change in the working day, there's been an increase in the rate of surplus value and therefore more surplus value. So what we have then is a situation where they've had an exchange of commodities taking place. This exchange of commodities depends upon putting workers to work to produce a surplus in production in value terms, which is sold on the market. And that, what do we mean in value terms? When we get down to it, of course, each commodity is going to be sold for money, and it's going to be invested on the basis of money. So Marx explains it that the process of production starts with money. We start with money. Capitalists buy means of production. they buy an employed workforce, they use those means of production in the employed workforce to produce a new commodity, which they expect to have more value. They sell that on the market, so they start with a certain amount of money and end up with more money. A profit is made and it's realized always in terms of money. But I might finish on this point, Paul. Money is not value. Money is not value. Money represents the value of the commodity and that is being produced and sold on the market. So that representation of value of the commodity could be in the form of another commodity like gold or silver or something, an actual physical commodity, or it also could be represented in form of what we might call fiat currency, paper currency, or bank deposits as honored or represented by the state. But either way, money represents a certain value in the commodities over time. It can, in a fiat economy, it can vary, of course. And that also applies to gold as well, if gold is the money, a physical commodity. But money is not value, it's a representation of value. And that's something we're going to have to discuss if we've got time today. So those are the main points that I wanted to make. And I'm now hoping that Aberlardo and Stavros will clear up all the errors I've made.
Thank you very much, Michael. And now we will pass over to either Stavros or Aberlardo. Who would like to go first, guys?
Aberlardo, I can do it. I can take the lead from Michael. But if you prefer, you can go ahead.
Yeah, it's okay. I can continue. I'm also going to share. Just a second. Okay. I agree in general with what Michael has already said. Maybe we can discuss some specific aspects later. My exposition is very brief. I think it's important at the beginning to give some idea of what is a law. As I put there, a law is a set of theoretical determinations that are relations among elements of reality that seek to explain that reality. Second idea that I think it's very important, there are different coexistent labor value theories and labor and different laws of labor. And I think it's important to be clear that these different labor value laws have their specificities. Smith and Ricardo have labor laws, but Marx labor law is different from them. I think that the main importance of Marx is that he specifically addresses how the capitalist mode of production operates as a historical determined mode of production. So the usual analysis says that labor has two dimensions. I think that in Marx, if we make a general analysis of all his works, labor has three dimensions. It's always concrete labor, and that as concrete labor is a source of wealth. When there's commodity production, it's also abstract labor, which is the foundation of exchange value. And as Michael said, exchange value appears as price and is as an expression of value. And the third level is that in capitalism, labor is wage labor, and as such is the source of surplus value and profit. What would be the general contents of a law of labor? The law of labor yes, all these the determinations that are articulated in a theory have to explain in general terms how production, distribution, exchange, and consumption articulate as moments of the general process of reproduction of a capitalist society. In as much as social production of use values must satisfy social needs in consumption, but social product must be allocated through social distribution rules among classes and among social, more specific and particular social groups. And finally, specific products, specific use values must be assigned to particular consumers that have particular consumption needs. More specifically, the law of labor has to take into account the specific social, political relations that underlie the capitalist mode of production. So what we have, see, is on the one hand, capital. Capital can be defined as the monopoly of propriety and use of means of production by non-producers. Evidently, here the property rights and access to means of production are essential to understand how the capital class is structured. And we have on the other side wage labor. Wage labor is that labor that is deprived of propriety and access and use of means of production. So the wage labor theory of value of Marx includes necessarily the exploitation of direct producers on the one hand, and also another important fact: capitalism implies the universal production of commodities. So there's the relevance of markets in the process of reproduction and of articulation of production, distribution, exchange, and consumption is very important to address and to explain. How would I synthesize Marxist law of wage labor? The Marxist law of wage labor considers simultaneously the social normal conditions of production. As Michael said, here is the average quantities of abstract labor, average, that are one of the determinants of the prices, the prices that operate normally in the markets. But it has also had to integrate, consider the social normal conditions of distribution. At a first level, the first form of distribution is the distribution of new value, of value added by lived labor between direct producers, the wage labor, and capital. And this is the basis of exploitation, is the distinction between value added and wages on the one side and surplus value on the other side. But the distribution has to consider also the distribution of the total surplus value extracted by the capitalist class to the labor class among them. The valorization is not just the extraction of surplus labor, but it's also its distribution among the different capitalists that participate in this process. Here, the determination of the general rate of profit is a fundamental law that has to be considered as a second determinant of the prices that normally regulate the general circulation of commodities. And the third element are the social normal conditions of realization. Marxists, we have been many times accused that we only focused on conditions of production, conditions of exploitation, but we don't take into account the conditions of realization of commodities. I think that's a mistake. In Marx, you can, not very well developed, you can track the problem that surges when in a decentralized society, such as capitalism, there is no pre-arrangement of relations between specific productive capacities that express the social division of labor and specific social needs. And this is a third element that has to be incorporated into the law of wage labor. Finally, in a synthetical perspective, what are the basic determinations then of Marx law of wage labor? First, concrete labors produce specific use values. Some of them are means of production, some of them are final consumption goods and services. This level refers to the process of reproduction of material conditions. On the second level, we have abstract labor, which is determined in as a result of competition among suppliers and demanders of all the different types of specific use values. We are at the level of explanation of general commodity circulation. In the third level, wage labor is the level that can explain us how surplus value is produced. Here, the level of analysis refers to competition among capitals in the first place, general competition, inter and intersectoral competition. And the specificity is that we analyze here the appropriation of surplus value. Well, first, the appropriation of surplus value as from wage laborers, and in a second level, the appropriation of surplus value among capitals, the redistribution, primary distribution of surplus value among industrial capitals. What are complementary determinations that have to be considered in more concrete levels of analysis? The distribution of surplus value between capital and landowners, gross profit versus territorial rent, and the distribution of gross profit among different forms of valorization. Basically, it's the division between entrepreneurs' profit, industrial and commercial profit on the one side, and property profit, interest that are accrued by the proprietors of capital, non-active proprietors of capital. So that would be what I can say in this first round. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Aberlardo. Excellent contribution. We will take some questions on everything that's just been stated a little bit later on. But right now, we're going to pass over to Stavros. Are you ready, Stavros?
Oh, yeah. Let me share a short PowerPoint. Okay, great. Hope it is eligible to everyone. Now, as I said, I'll pick up from where Michael and Aberlardo ended. Let me try recapitulate a few things and then make some additional points. What's the low value? Its basic idea is that in a commodity producing economy, and especially a capitalist commodity producing economy, market prices, that is the actual prices we observe in the market are being determined by something else, something more fundamental and more stable to market prices that lays behind. And this economic variable is called value. So the general background on which the law value rests is that values determine prices. Now, we have two streams of value theories, which are both based on Adam Smith's distinction between use value and exchange value. The first stream is objective value theories, and the second, subjective value theories. Subjective value theories are those of the classical and the Marxist political economy. Subjective value theories are those that initially adhered the proponents, the forefathers of economics, the marginalist school. That is the marginalist school. Objective value theories argue that value is the objective expenditure of human labor in producing a commodity. Thus, they are basically labor theory of values. Subjective value theories argue that value is the subjective utility derived by the use of a commodity. Now, let me move on to objective value theories and leave aside this rather short-lived subjective labor theories of value. In Adam Smith, we have two value theories and two conceptions of the law value, consequently. The first, the value theory of embodied labor, as it was later on named following Ricardo, of course. That is that value is the labor expended in the production process of a commodity A. And then we have the second, Smith's second definition of value, a second value theory of commanded labor. That is the labor contained in a commodity B with which commodity A is exchanged. For Smith, these two value theories were equivalent. Either way you measure value, you end up with the same result. Of course, this is not true, and Ricardo and Marx correctly showed that they are not equivalent, and you have to decide. Now, with Ricardo, we have the culmination of the classical political economy and its theory of value, and of course, its law value. It is his value theory of embodied labor. Its main characteristics are the following. First, he has this problem to which Bob referred in the beginning. How you equalize different types of laboring activity, different types of work. And because you need to find a measure of value. So you have a normalization problem. Ricardo answered to this normalization problem by simply considering the technical aspects and not the social aspects of the production process and of the total circuit of capital afterwards. That is, he considered the equalization of different forms of value, of labor, as a simply technical project, by considering only their technical dimensions and not class struggle and the social dimension implicated in this process. A second characteristic of Ricardo's approach was that he considered that labor values more or less directly determine market prices. Of course, he knew that market prices fluctuate and deviate, but he considered this as a very short-term event, fact with no serious consequences, and thus not requiring a thorough theoretical analysis. And this was complemented by another weakness in Ricardo's approach the fact that he had a weak competition theory, a weak theory for competition. Competition in Ricardo is almost instantaneous. Now, Karl Marx built upon the previous two, but also departed radically from them. The basic, the foundation of the Marxian rupture, the Marxian break, is the emphasis on the social dimension of the economy. But from this emphasis on the social dimension derive also practical, in terms of measurement and so on, and technical considerations. Let me try to pinpoint some of them in brief. First, as I already said, Marx considered both the technical and the social aspect of labor expenditure in production. Hence, he defined the labor expended as abstract labor, meaning socially equalized labor. Thus, it considered the social aspect. And the social aspect encompasses class struggle and struggle within the capitalist class, competition between capitals. It encompasses both the struggle between capital and labor and the interesting struggle between capitals in capitalist competition. Second, he more rigorously than Ricardo defined a more complex process of determination of prices by values. So labor values are transformed to prices of production, that is, take into account intra-capitalist competition, and then are transformed to market prices, that is, taking into account also supply, short-term supply and demand fluctuations. So in Marx, you have a much more sophisticated law value. You have labor values, which are socially equated, not only technically equated. These are being transformed to prices of production when you take account also the competition between capitals, whereas in the determination of labor values, you take into account basically the struggle between capital and labor. And then you have the transformation of prices of production to market prices, where you take into account short-term fluctuations and disequilibria, that is, the fluctuations between supply and demand. The Marxian conception rests on a sophisticated and much more realistic theory of competition, whose differentiates specifically, its main difference from other theories of competition is that it considers not only competition within sectors, but also competition between sectors, intersectoral competition, and not only intrasectoral competition. On the basis of this, Marx argues that the law value operates, but in a dynamic sense, meaning what? Labor values determine prices of production determine market prices, but each subsequent stage has a decrease of freedom. You have the variable A determining the variable B, but there are some degrees of freedom in this determination. So neither the prices of production and of course nor the market prices are exactly the same as the labor values that determine them. So Marx's famous dictum that it is only an exceptional case when market prices are directly the same with the determining labor values. Rather, market prices oscillate around labor values, which operate as their centers of gravity. Now, let me try to codify all this. So the law value in Marxist political economy analysis is the regulating principle of the exchange of the products of human work. What it does is it brings order in the anarchy of the capitalist production. And it regulates three main kinds of relations. First, relations between people, social relations, both the relations between capital and labor, class struggle between capital and labor, but also the relations and the antagonism between capitals, intra-capitalist competition. Second, it regulates the relations between people and their economic products. These are purely technical relations. And third, it regulates the relation between economic products themselves. These are the relation of equivalence, that is the exchange values of the commodities. More specifically, through the law of value, it is three things are achieved in capitalism. First, the distribution of the means of production among sectors. Second, the distribution of the labor force among sectors. And third, the market prices of commodities. Now, of course, there are modifications in the operation of the law of market. One important modification is in the world market, when we move to the internationally exchanged commodities. There is another crucial aspect. I'll bypass all this very fast, relating the law of value and crisis. It plays a significant role. The falling profitability, and thus the law of the falling rate of profit that leads to over accumulation of capital, ultimately implies a deviation from the law of value, and thus a violent crisis, economic crisis, as a means to re-establish the operation of the law of value. There is a very serious debate nowadays regarding whether the Marxian law of value is an equilibrium theory. In my opinion, it is not. It's a dynamic theory, not a general equilibrium theory. But a dynamic theory needs to consider points of equilibrium as transitory centers of gravity. And in my opinion, the Marxian law of value does this. It is not a general equilibrium approach. It is a dynamic approach, but it considers transitory points of equilibrium. The last point I want to emphasize or to focus upon are the following: are older and rather modern deformations of Marxist theory of value and the Marxian conception of the law of value. Here we have two main representatives. The first is neo-Ricardianism. Since Piero Sraffa's contribution, and particularly the attack led by Stedman afterwards, that you can calculate the prices of production directly from physical quantities without needing labor values, and then from the prices of production determine market prices in a general equilibrium framework, which is another significant departure from the Marxist perspective. Now, this has been the object of debate, of the value debate of the 70s and the 80s. The Marxist replies to neo-Ricardian technicism are well known. I won't expand on this unless needed in the discussion. Now, what is equally problematic is a supposedly anti-Ricardian reply, which very curiously ended up with the same conclusions with the neo-Ricardians, namely that labor values are redundant. This stream are the so-called, I call them the pseudo-Rubinist value form theories. And I refer mainly to two related breeds of theory, the value form theories of the type of Benetti, Cartellier, Reuten, and Williams, Backhaus, and also the so-called monetary theories of value nowadays of Michael Heinrich and David Harvey. This stream began as a reaction to neo-Ricardianism by emphasizing the social aspects of the Marxian analysis, which was a correct point of departure. But the rest of the journey is totally misguided and unproductive. They tried to find a direct social incarnation of value. They thought that they discovered this in money, and thus they inordinately equated value with money, and thus made value a circulationist concept. Value is determined in the exchange with commodities. This is very akin to Smith's commanded theory of value. And in the end, they equated value with money, and they completely neglected, they dropped out of the picture labor time. The current version are the so-called monetary theories of value of the Neue lecture, the German Neue lecture, and with David Harvey as their propagator. They are totally misguided, in my opinion. They depart completely with the Marxian perspective, and they end up very closely, on the one hand, with neo-Ricardianism. Labor values are not necessary, and on the other hand, with neoclassical economics. In the end, neoclassical economics have dropped even their subjective values, utility, and they consider only monetary prices. By equating value with money, we are very close to this position. That's it.
Thank you very much, Stavros. Once again, excellent contribution. We're now going to go over to our Facebook page. We have some questions for you guys, for all three of you. So I'll read out the first question now. It's from Circa Kashler. And the question is, what are the possibilities that use value can prevail against exchange value? I mean, when we talk about socialism, we are talking predominantly about human relations based on use value instead of exchange value. So that was a question from Circa Kashler. Any of you guys would like to answer that?
Well, let me just say, I think that's a good question, because what is socialism in that sense, if we're looking at it from the point of view of the labor theory of value, what it's telling us, and as I said originally, is that Marx started off by saying that when he looked at a critique of capitalism, he started off looking at the commodity. And he started off with what he called the commodity, because the commodity, which is production of, if you like, of use values for exchange, for money, means that a product becomes more than just a product that people need, whether people as a whole in society need it. It becomes a commodity that can be sold on the market. So it obtains two parts of value, use value and exchange value. And as the questioner says, what we really want is a society where production is for use values directly towards social need, and not production for exchange in order to make a profit for those that own the commodity, the means of production, and employ a labor force to produce it. And they only produce for a profit. They only produce, they invest money in order to make more money. That is the system of the capitalist mode of production. So we get more use values, we get more production, but we get production, as both Aberlardo and Stavros have said, which is distorted in the direction in various ways, both in growing inequality, because of course wages are low as a result, but also the products produced are not necessarily in the interests of society as a whole and social need. They're in interests of what is profitable to the owner's capital, and they compete between themselves and exploit the workforce to do so, to produce those things, not to produce social needs. So what we want is a society that produces for social need, for humanity as a whole, for the commons. I think the question asked, what are the possibilities of achieving that? Well, that is, of course, a big political question, which relates not necessarily to a discussion of the nature of the labour theory of value, except that the labour theory of value explains the difference between a capitalist mode of production and what a socialism would aim at, which is direct production for social need. The possibilities of achieving that remain to be seen. We are continuing in struggle, are we not? For some of us, maybe the questioners are a bit younger than me anyway, and maybe they'll be able to be around to see that happen in some form over the next few decades.
Excellent response, Michael. Stavros, Aberlardo, do you guys have anything to add to that question?
Yeah.
I will add a couple of questions. I agree with Michael. In capitalism, profitability subordinates exchange value production and also use value production. The only way in which use value could predominate in the society is eliminating profitability as the objective of production. That's very clear. I would just like to add something. I think Marxists, we are also analyzing, maybe we didn't pay too much attention before, that we also have to criticize the production of use values as it is done in capitalism. Because the production of use value, as Marx said, is the exchange of human society with nature. So we have to change our idea of what are social needs, and the satisfaction of social needs and the production of use values has to take into account that human beings, we are part of nature, and that the reproduction of our societies, the satisfaction of social needs, has to take this into account, as a central element in the necessary reconstruction of the relations of production, distribution, exchange, and consumption. I think that although we can be able, I don't know when still, to construct a new society focused on the satisfaction of social needs, the necessity of distribution of social product and the necessity of exchanging specific use values is still a problem. So this is not a new issue, but it has to be taken into account, that we have to think of new forms, specifically of exchange of use values, different use values, so they reach the specific consumers and satisfy specific needs. Thank you.
Well, let me add 2 points. Adam Smith had replied to this question very accurately. He said that use value, that is utility afterwards in economics, is very subjective. So no economic system can operate on the basis of a very unstable, on the basis of very unstable personal whims, because utility is personal whim. So we have to base economic analysis on exchange values and thus values. Second point, neoclassical economics in general, because Keynesians do not depart from this. They share the same macroeconomics to a great extent. Have a well-known problem in defining utility and find a representative consumer. So they used first the ordinal utility theory, then the cardinal utility theory. We know all very well that these are problematic answers. They know it very well, and they continue. So regarding the economic analysis of capitalism, there is no other way than an objective theory of value, and an objective theory of value is a labor theory of value. Unless you go to Samuelson's wisecracking, let's use oil or wheat or something like this, which was just a wisecracking to say why you are infatuated with labor. It's obvious why Marxism is infatuated with labor.
Thank you very much, Stavros. We've got another question for you guys as well. This is again from our Facebook page, and this is from Ulysses. And his question to you three is the theory of value the most important contribution of Marx? And if it is, how can it be used in a political struggle of the classes?
Well, Ulysses, good name. Yes, well, I think I said in my introduction that Marx's theory of value is certainly a major contribution to us understanding how the capitalist system of production works. Because as Stavros has said, there are other versions of a theory of value, but they do not explain the capitalist mode of production properly. And they do not give us a clear understanding not only of the process of exploitation which takes place under capitalism, but also they don't explain why market prices are where they are properly. They don't do that job properly. And as Stavros pointed out, Marx's theory of value does explain that better than any other theory. We've just had the theory of modern mainstream economics to explain prices is supply and demand. As Engels once said, well, that's a fat lot of help because yes, a price is determined by the supply and demand, but why is the supply and demand setting the price of a car at $20,000 and supply and demand setting the price of a sofa at $200? There is no explanation for the differences between these. Stavros referred to Paul Samuelson, the mainstream economist of the second half of the 20th century, who eventually came up with a theory of value or prices, if you like. He said the theory of prices is this: it's what the market says is the price. That is the explanation of why a car is at $20,000, because that's what the market says it is. That is a completely, that's a theory of value produced to a nonsense. In other words, it gives us no answer whatsoever. So in that sense, Marx's theory of value has made a big contribution. As I said earlier, the main thing that it makes is to explain the contradiction between production for exchange value and actually what we need, production for social need, and how capitalism has created a contradiction there in the process of production. But that's not what Marx considered his main contribution. I'll finish on this, Paul. He didn't think his theory of value was his main contribution in the sense of a labor theory of value. He thought his main contribution was to explain how the process of exploitation took place under a capitalist mode of production, as opposed to one under a slave society or a feudal society. It was through what I call the money trick. It was the fact that wage labor is put to work and they receive a wage. It appears to be a fair deal, but actually they produce more in labor time than they get in their wages in labor time. And that extra surplus in labor time is incorporated into the sale of the product or the commodity on the market. And so it doesn't appear in number of hours that you've worked, you can't see it. It's built into the appropriation of the value in the commodity and selling it on the market. Marx said that that was his biggest contribution to value theory, in addition to the points that I've just made about his explanation of, which had started with, as Stavros says, with the classical economists like Smith and Ricardo, his explanation how you actually connect daily market prices to what is going on in the process of production in a modern economy.
Thank you very much, Michael. Aberlardo, Stavros, you guys have anything to add to that question?
Yeah, can I go? Yes. No, I'm sure I knew it, but it's good. We agree almost, except some details. Yeah, I think that the Marxist theory of labor value is central. I have maybe a broader, more extensive, a broader approach of what theory of labor value is in Marx. That's why I specify it more as a theory of wage labor law. So it includes the exploitation of wage labor as an integrating part of the law. And
Yeah.
in this sense, I agree with Michael. Yes, the process of explaining how the centers of gravity of market prices operate normally in a capitalist society includes the foundational fact that labor in capitalism is exploited labor. So it has, and that the producers, well, the producer entities are guided in all their decisions by profitability. Yes, so in these terms, the extent of validity of the theory of labor value, in my perspective, is much broader. Second point, why is it broader? Because Marx has, everybody agrees that it has a theory of supply, but Marx also has a theory of demand. And I'm not talking about fluctuations of demand that explain the fluctuations of market prices. No, Marx has a theory of demand that it's not based in the individual subjective needs that are completely volatile and yeah. No, Marx has a theory of demand that it's based in the social objectives needs of consumption for the reproduction of society. So if you have the production, normal conditions of production, you have a social division of labor, you have a productive capacities existing in different labors that use different types of technologies, that organize differently the labor and production processes. And from such structure of production, in order for the systems to reproduce, there's a structure of demand that it's objectively determined. In general, all the capitalists have to reproduce to all the means of productions that they have consumed. This is not static. Evidently, in the process of reproduction, there's going to be decisions of reallocation of social capacities among sectors. There's going to be decisions of technological change, organizational change. But you have a general framework of what is the structure of demand to fulfill the reproduction. In terms of wages, the potential level of demand for means of consumption is determined by the level of wages, which depends on the rate of exploitation in the first place. Some subjective decisions really matter, but at a very, very marginal stance. I mean, if I prefer to eat bread or tortilla, it's relevant, well, maybe for the producer of tortillas, but socially is not the most important issue. Third point, and this I take one of the statements of Stavros, which is really, really important. The importance of the law of labor value of Marx analytically, is precisely the fact that it's not an equilibrium theory. That's very, very important. Why? Because the results of the general operation of the law of labor value are very interesting. There is a process of equalization of expended labors. I'm thinking about the reduction of complex labor to simple labor. There's also an equalization of intersectoral flows, which Marx analyzes in the reproduction schemes. And there's also an equalization of profit rates. But all these equalization results are only tendential. And the important thing is that these different movements that emanate from the operation of the law of labor value have as a result tendencies towards certain equilibria, but these equilibria are contradictory among them. So the result is that the process always reproduces in disequilibria. An example, see, as a result of intrasectoral competition, we have a permanent differentiation of intrasectoral profit rates, depending on the efficiency, the relative efficiency of particular firms inside a sector. As a result of intersectoral competition in the mid-run, we have as a result the differentiation of sectoral profit rates. In general, what we have is that there are sectors that have a relative excessive productive capacity, and these sectors tend to obtain in the middle run a normal sectoral profit rate that is above, well, no, if it's excessive, it's below other sectors that have a relative insufficient productive capacity, always in relation with normal social needs. So what's interesting, the tendencies to the equalization of the profit rates, as Marx says, is a continuous result of competition, but it's a result that is continuously questioned by competition. So what prevails in every moment in a capitalist system is differential profit rates among sectors and differential profit rates among firms at the inside each sector. So in my perspective, this is very important, but because only in this framework of disequilibria in profitability, you can explain the dynamics of the system. If you have an equilibrium system, you don't know how the system is going to move. But if you have as a model, a system in which there are differential rates of profit within a sector, you know that the dynamics of the accumulation is not just quantitative, but qualitative. Capitals have to look for the most efficient forms of production, technologic organization, or else they disappear. And in terms of sectoral difference of profit rates, that explains the movement of capital among sectors and the birth, excuse me, of new sectors and the dysfunction of old sectors. So I think that this law is also a law, by the way it is constructed, that it's natural. It's the basis, the natural basis for a dynamic theory of capitalism, a theory that explains the dynamics of valorization and the dynamics of accumulation. Stavros said, I think that the tendency, the general tendency of the profit rate to to fall can also be derived from the law of labor value. Thank you.
Let me make 3 points regarding the question about value theory and class struggle and Marx's contribution. First, I believe that Marx actually downsized himself when he said that he hasn't made any significant contribution regarding value theory, only regarding the theory of exploitation, that is a surplus value theory. I think he was being too modest. His theory of value, as I tried to analyze, has significant merits and advantages over Ricardo's, for example. Second point, regarding the relation of the law of value and value theory and class struggle. Let me make three codifications or distinctions. The classical political economy used the law of value and had a class struggle conception, but it was mainly a class struggle conception, or a conception of class struggle between capitalists and landowners. Only as a residual was a class struggle between capital and labor. Mainly it was class struggle between capitalists and landowners, which were a deformed residual of the old feudal class before being assimilated within the capitalist class per se. Now, Marxism associates his value theory and his law of value, of course, to class struggle, but primarily on class struggle between capital and labor. Of course, it considers other forms of class struggle, even interscene class struggle, the struggle between the different fractions of capital. But its primary objective is the basic relationship of capitalism, that is the contradiction between capital and labor, and with a certain aim to overthrow capitalism and replace it with socialism. Third point, I refer to those approaches that deform Marx's theory of value and his law of value, and I refer on the one hand to neo-Ricardians, on the other hand to the so-called value form theories or the pseudo-Rubinists. Pseudo because they deform Rubin, Isaac Elitch Rubin as well. Now, they both concur in the end that labor values, in the sense of labor time, are useless and redundant. But they have also another common element, although they appear as completely opposite sides of the debate. The other common element they have, both of them, is that Marxist political economy, Marxism, the communist movement, should not have an independent existence, an autonomous course, focusing on overthrowing capitalism and creating socialism, but should be the fellow travelers of bourgeois reformism. For example, the Neue lecture, David Harvey and the rest, when arguing that Marx had no value theory. He was a subversive thinker with no fixed points, just a critical mind. So socialism, it's something like expecting paradise on earth. Don't bother with this. As David Harvey wrote down recently, what we have to do is just support bourgeois reformist initiatives. That's it.
Thank you very much, Stavros. We have another question for the three of you again. This is off our Facebook page also, and it's from Ricardo Gomez. And his question to you three gentlemen is, what is the role of dialectical contradictions and the labor theory of value? So anybody that would like to jump in first with that, feel free.
Well, we're going to struggle with this one. Well, I think Aberlardo, in a way, has presented the basis of this point, that Marx does not approach an understanding of both the capitalist production and, for that matter, the materials of history and the history of human society from the point of view of saying that it's some sort of progressive step in one direction or up or down. But there is contradictions both in history, but also in modern capitalist mode of production. We've pointed out the basic contradiction as expressed in the labor theory of value between labor and capital and the exploitation of labor and capital. But that contradictions are also expressed in the fact that in the end, capitalism cannot deliver the productive forces sufficient to provide social need for the world's population. We see a growing contradiction between the drive for profitability and the failure to produce use values for social need, a fundamental contradiction in the capitalist mode of production. And so, if you like, that is a dialectical process. We see a series of contradictions, the fundamental one of exploitation, the one of the failure of capitalism to develop productive forces because it has a contradiction of profitability versus productivity, if you like. What we want is to reduce labor time to the minimum and maximize the use values in that labor time so people are freed up to do things in their lives that don't depend on surviving from day to day. Profitability of capital blocks that process. It took it forward for a period, but now it blocks that process. It's a contradictory process, one that is not resolved without the removal of the capitalist mode of production. The other point I would make, Paul, is that we have to understand that Marx, as Stavros and Aberlardo said, that the labor theory of values are not an equilibrium theory. It's a theory of tendencies and counter-tendencies. This is a dialectical process. So there are very important tendencies in the capitalist mode of production. The drive for profitability is the main one, you like, but there are counter-tendencies which block that drive for profitability and also try to reverse the process. And we have in the law of profitability itself that Marx describes a tendency for the rate of profit to fall, but we have counter tendencies which keep that profitability from going straight downwards. It's curbed and held back. So there's a contradiction here going on, but tendencies and counter tendencies also mean they have to be resolved. The main tendency is the failure of capitalism to deliver productive forces because of the falling rate of profitability. Counter tendencies can help to slow that down, but they can't reverse that process. So I would see, if you want to talk about capitalism in dialectical terms, we have to look at it from the point of view of the contradictions that exist in the capitalist system and the tendencies and counter tendencies which exist in the process of the laws of motion of capitalism.
Thank you very much, Michael. Aberlardo, would you like to answer that question?
This is a very, very interesting and important question. What's the role of dialectic contradictions? The construction of Marx theory is based on dialectics. It's a methodological, I would say, a central aspect of Marxist theory. But the main thing is that this is the result of the fact that reality it functions upon dialectic contradictions. It's not a matter of choice for the analysts. It's a result of a good analysis. So formally, as I delivered in my exposition, I identify, for example, 3 levels: concrete labor, abstract labor, wage labor. Where are the dialectical contradictions present in this structure? The dominant force or the dominant level is the level of wage labor. Wage labor subordinates abstract labor, and it subordinates also concrete labors in capitalism. How does it show? Commodities, the center, the gravity centers of market prices are not what we call the direct values, but prices of production. And this fact express the subordination of abstract labor and use value to profitability for the production of surplus value, of exploitation of labor value. And this is a contradictory result, because there are some studies that have demonstrated that if exchange is based on prices of production, allocation of capital can be efficient, but in terms of profitability, it doesn't have to be efficient. The result not necessarily leads to efficiency in terms of productivity of labor. And that's very important. As Michael said, we have to organize a society in which efficiency, productive efficiency, is the center of allocation of productive resources. I won't, well, I can say that that subordination of use value to abstract, to exchange value, and to surplus value is very clear. In our capitalist society, the things, the use values that are produced, can make, most of them, I don't know most, but many of them don't really satisfy social needs. And that's one of the strongest dimensions of capitalism. What is produced, how is it produced, is irrelevant. It's only relevant in terms of the profitability. So we have very big industries, weapons, people, drugs. Are these are use values that they are no social use values, but they are use values and they are very profitable. Technologies, we're destroying nature. It doesn't matter, because the central element is profitability. So yes, I think dialectic contradiction is a central dimension of Marxist theory. And I think that Marxist theory is a good theory, is a valuable theory, precisely because these dialectical contradictions express the way reality operates by, every day. Thank you.
Let me add a few points. First, the Marxist economic analysis cannot be understood without its methodology, and its methodology is dialectical materialism, materialist dialectics. That is the notion that the world that we live in, first, it is material, and second, it's riddled with contradictions. And this is a dynamic theory focusing on transformations and aiming to change, to theorize change. Dialectics from their very inception is a dynamic theory aiming to change, not to stability, not to harmony. First point, and this is a realistic theory. First point this. Second point, all the attacks on Marxism and Marxist political economy, either by force or by friends, are in the end rooted on a misconception or a rejection of dialectics, beginning with Mavroudeas' attack and critique about the transformation, the so-called transformation problem and so on. It is based on his explicit rejection of dialectics. Mavroudeas is very clear on this. The fundamental error of Marx begins from his methodology. What methodology? Dialectics. It is crap. Let's use positivism. And then economics, neoclassical and Keynesian, the same approach in the end, positivism. On the other hand, the so-called friends of Marx, in the form of the value form theories, go to the other hand. They end up with a form of dialectics which is not materialist. When you end up with value forms that you have form without essence, You have the value form, but you do not have labor values.
Yeah.
This is form without essence. This is a form of idealist dialectics, very akin to that of Hegel. Of course, Hegel was far superior in his analysis and conception than his modern, no, they are not Hegelians per se, but they are very close to that. So dialectics are crucial. You cannot understand Marxist economic analysis unless you grasp its methodology, and this is dialectical materialism.
Thank you very much, Stavros. I do have one more question, and this is... Oh, sorry.
Yeah, just one. I want to add one thing about this, one point. If you analyze the development of modern physics, you can see that modern physics theory is based, its construction, in dialectical contradictions that express the dialectical contradiction operation of reality. And I'm talking about reality in a really broad sense. So if you take the traditional gravity theory, and then comes Einstein, the relativity theory, there's a lot of contradictions. One of the big efforts in modern physics theory is how to articulate all these partial comprehension of partial natural phenomena into the big unified theory. And this big unified theory, it's a dialectical theory. It has to be, because it has different elements that have different levels of necessity that are contradictory, but that they have synthetic results. What I have read lately in this pandemic is about the theory of strings. And it's really fantastic, because the theory of strings, I don't understand much about it, but the project is a project in which the idea is to construct a dialectical theory that explains all the contradictions natural to the operation of our world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aberlardo. I do have one more question for you, actually, and it's of vested interest to me because I'm actually moving to Mexico City next month. And the question is, obviously the elections were last Sunday, and I'd like to know how the elections went and what it means for the country going forward, and especially for AMLO as well. If you'd like to comment on that, I'd be very grateful. Oh, we seem to have lost your sound there, Aberlardo.
He's muted. He's muted.
Sorry.
There it is.
Okay. We are happy. It's an intermediate federal election in very harsh conditions, pandemia, big crisis associated to the pandemia. We were already in a contraction before the pandemia, because there's a very big, many capitalists are boycotting the process, evidently. Why are we happy? Because we retain absolute majority in the federal parliament, and it's a broad majority. It's not a qualified majority. No, it's not 66%, but it's around 60%. So we are going to negotiate for specific matters this qualified majority that is needed, especially for constitutional reforms. So we are very happy. Another very, very interesting result is that Morena and the Progressive Bloc, we control the government of 7 of 32 states of the Federation. And after this election, now we control 17 of these 32. So the presence of the Progressive Bloc, led by Morena, it's not just a presence in the south and southwest part of the country, the poor but non-progressive part of the country. It has penetrated dramatically in all the north, especially the Pacific north of the country. So all the Pacific coast up to the border to the US, we gained the election, and with very, very big support. And we are advancing also in recovering the central and the Gulf north part of Mexico. So that's also a very, very important achievement of this election. There was a slight drawback in Mexico City because we have had complete majority in Mexico City, the different electoral left expressions since 1997. But in this election, it seems that we lost the control of the majority of the local governments, alcaldías. We had 11 of 16, and after this election, it seems we're only going to have 7 out of 16. But we still retain the majority of the local Congress. That's good news. It's going to be a very small margin, but we still have the majority in the local Congress. Why did this happen? Because there's an organized opposition strategy inserted in this Obama and Clinton new strategy of soft coup d'etat that has been operating in Mexico since the moment we won the election. So the 3 main opposition parties, right, center, left, they united in a national front. They don't have a unifying program. The only thing that unifies them is the aggressive attack on the government with the usual rhetorics. This political bloc is sustained by large segments of the Mexican bourgeoisie, by large segments of the organic intellectuality that expresses in the media, and evidently it has support from abroad. It's not, and with this I finish, it's very interesting because Kamala Harris made a trip. She went to Guatemala and made very harsh declarations about Guatemala, telling them, don't migrate to the United States. It's very, very aggressive. On Monday, she visited Mexico. Okay? What would have happened if in the Sunday election we hadn't retained the absolute majority of parliament? I think that Kamala Harris would have had a very interventionist and aggressive discourse for the Mexican president. It was all prepared. The media, Kamala Harris Monday morning in Mexico City. This is not just paranoia. There was a press release in which Kamala Harris addressed the Guatemalan and the Mexican governments in terms of the lack of democracy, of corruption, of the lack of free operation of the media, of the press. And that was published in many sources on Monday night. And I think that was a discourse that was prepared in the eventuality that we lost the majority in parliament. But the next day, the US government backed up and said, no, we were just referring to Guatemala. We were not referring to Mexico. So that's how I see the thing. So we're very happy. We're making a very critical analysis because there are many things that we don't like of what's going on. It's only 3 years we've been in the government. It's very difficult to start to change structures, corporative structures that were placed in Mexico more than 100 years ago, and that operate in everyday relationships. It's very hard to break that, but we're working on it, and we're very happy about the election results.
Fantastic news, Aberlardo. Yeah, I was in Mexico City in December, and I saw all the tents in Zocalo, and all these tents were empty, but it was meant to be some kind of right-wing protest against AMLO, but there was nobody in the tents. It was quite funny. I was like, hey, this is meant to be a protest, there's nobody there.
It's the ultra-right entrepreneurs, capitalist entrepreneurs. They haven't reached a very, I would say, expressive manifestation, in part because of the pandemic. But they express electorally. They attract 40-45% of the voting at the national level. Well, but fighting is on. And repeat, I think it was a very, very successful election, especially taking into account this very, very difficult context. Mexico, the Mexican government has instrumented policies against the pandemic that are very unorthodox. What is the main unorthodoxy of the approach? No new debt to address the pandemic. So Salvador has contracted billions of dollars of debt. Everybody is financing the fight against the pandemic and the crisis with new debt. And Mexico said, no, we're going to address this problem in a different perspective. They have focused especially on the increase of fiscal recaudation, which is being very, very, very successful. They have been dismantling an industry, a real industry, the fake facturas, invoices. There was an industry completely of producing and selling fake invoices for tax evasion. So that's being dismantled, and many capitalist enterprises are actually paying taxes. Even they are paying old debts, and it's being used to finance activities. So that's a very, very big difference. It's being very much criticized, even from left segments. And what I address is that debt escalation is not a left perspective, that's a Keynesian perspective. I think that a leftist perspective is more a redistribution perspective. We can have more money to spend if we can achieve that the ones that have more money pay more taxes. Independently, if you make a formal fiscal transformation, the first aim has been to let's get the taxes that we can get with the actual fiscal system. Later we will see. And it's been important politically because you have this position, and the president confirmed this yesterday with the main capitalist groups. We're not going to raise tax rates. If you pay what you have to pay right now, we're not going to elevate the rates. And this has been important because one segment of the capitalist, the Mexican bourgeoisie, is collaborating in the structural projects that the government is carrying out since last year. So this part is not participating in this, or at least is not so openly participating in the general imperialist strategy of soft coup d'etat. So let's be happy. I think we have the opportunity of re-editing in a new perspective the pink tide in Latin America. Two things: the result of the Bolivian election is sensational. because they made a coup d'etat, and 1 year later, the people said, no, we don't want neoliberalism. Maybe the progressive governments are very inefficient, but it's preferable to have a progressive, effective government than to return to neoliberalism. I think the same happened in Argentina. I think the same will happen in Brazil eventually, and the results in Peru are also very, very encouraging. Ecuador, we couldn't make it in Ecuador, but I think there's a general trend in Latin America that seems to be very interesting.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for that, Aberlardo. When I come to Mexico City next month, we should share a pulque and have a chat. That would be nice.
Of course, and you are invited to my house. If you want to stay here, I have space. And
that is very generous. I will get in touch with you through Christian. Thank you so much. And thank you also, Michael and Stavros, for your contributions today. It's been a fantastic webinar. I hope you guys have enjoyed it as much as we have. Thank you to everyone that contributed a question and also tuned in on our Facebook page and also the streaming. So thank you so much, guys. Take care, and we will see you soon. Thank you, guys.
It was a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye, guys.
Bye.